Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're going somewhere peaceful. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere eternal. Somewhere you can finally rest. After you finish the paperwork. Because ancient Egyptians did not believe the afterlife was a reward you simply received. They believed it was a process. A system. A divine government office where your soul had to prove it deserved to continue existing. And if that sounds stressful, it's because it was. In modern life, death is usually imagined as a final exit. A door closing. A quiet fade out. But in ancient Egypt, death was more like being transferred to a different department. Same you. Same responsibilities. Just with more gods. More rules. And a much higher chance of being eaten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because tonight, we are stepping into one of the strangest ideas humans ever created. A belief system where the afterlife was not a dream. Not a paradise. Not even a mystery. It was an administrative machine. And the ancient Egyptians took it so seriously that they basically spent their entire lives preparing to die correctly. Which is, a choice. Now, you've probably heard the basics. Mummies. Pyramids. Pharaohs. The Book of the Dead. A heart being weighed against a feather. And some crocodile lion hippo monster waiting to eat you if you mess up. And yes, all of that is real. But what most people don't realize is that those famous images are only the surface layer. Because underneath the gold masks and dramatic mythology is something far more relatable and honestly far more horrifying. The Egyptian afterlife was built like a legal system. And the gods were not kind. They were bureaucrats. And they were extremely picky. In Egypt, dying wasn't the end. It was the beginning of your most important trial. And you had to show up prepared. With the right documents. The right passwords. The right rituals. And the right moral record. Otherwise, you didn't go to hell. You didn't burn forever. You didn't get tortured by demons. You got something much more terrifying. You got erased. Your soul was deleted like a file. And you ceased to exist. Ancient Egypt's greatest fear wasn't pain. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't fire. It was non-being. It was becoming nothing. And to avoid that, Egyptians built an entire civilization around the concept of staying alive after death. Not symbolically. Literally. And that's why their tombs were so elaborate. That's why they mummified bodies. That's why they carved spells on walls. That's why they packed graves with food, furniture, jewelry, and tiny servant statues. Because for them, death was not a finish line. It was a border crossing. And the afterlife had security. Here's where things get interesting. Because the Egyptian afterlife wasn't just one place. It wasn't like, oh you die, you go to the afterlife. It was a layered journey. A sequence. A series of checkpoints. And at every checkpoint, something could go wrong. And if something went wrong, you were done. Not punished. Not tortured. Just, ended. Which means the entire Egyptian religion, in a way, was built around one very simple question. How do I not get spiritually destroyed? And the answer was. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how bad could it be? Let's put it this way. The ancient Egyptians believed your soul was not one thing. It was several things. Multiple spiritual components, each with its own needs. And if even one of those components failed to function properly, you could lose your afterlife. Imagine if modern humans believed your survival depended on keeping 5 different invisible versions of yourself alive at the same time. One of them needs food. One of them needs a house. One of them needs your name spoken out loud. One of them needs your body intact. And one of them needs to pass a courtroom trial. That is ancient Egypt. And the wildest part is that they weren't casually believing this. They were intensely committed. To the point that their burial practices shaped their economy, their architecture, their art, their politics, their entire concept of morality. Egypt didn't just build pyramids because they were fancy. Egypt built pyramids because the afterlife demanded infrastructure. And the gods were not going to accept a cheap solution. So tonight, we're going to walk through the Egyptian afterlife exactly as they imagined it. Step by step. Not in a dry textbook way, but in the way it would actually feel if you were an ancient Egyptian, lying on your deathbed, knowing that soon you would wake up in a world where the rules were strict, the dangers were strange, and the gods did not care that you were tired. And we're going to see why, for ancient Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't a comforting fantasy. It was an exhausting second life. To understand the Egyptian afterlife, we have to start with something that sounds simple but changes everything. In ancient Egypt, you didn't have a soul. You had a soul system. A collection of parts. And these parts were not optional. They were not poetic metaphors. They were treated like real components of your existence. And if you want to understand why Egyptians mummified bodies, built tombs, carved spells, and obsessed over names, this is where it begins. The ancient Egyptians believed you were made up of things like your body, of course. But also your ka, your ba, your ak, your ren, your shadow. And sometimes more depending on the time period. And yes, I know that sounds like a fantasy RPG character sheet. But for them, this was reality. Let's break it down gently, in a way that won't wake you up. The ka was like your spiritual energy. Your life essence. The part of you that needed food and drink. Yes. Even after death. Which is why tombs were stocked with offerings. Because if your ka starved, you could weaken. And if you weakened, your whole afterlife situation could collapse. So the ka needed to be fed. Constantly. Forever. And this is where the first level of Egyptian afterlife bureaucracy begins. Because now your eternal survival depends on whether your living relatives keep bringing food to your tomb. And if you think modern family dynamics are stressful, imagine knowing that your immortality depends on your nephew not being lazy. Egyptians were not stupid. They realized that living people forget. They move away. They die. They stop caring. So they invented a workaround. They carved food offerings into stone. They painted bread and beer on walls. They wrote lists of food on tomb walls like a divine grocery receipt. Because in Egyptian belief, an image of food could become real food in the spiritual world. This is important. Because it means tomb decoration wasn't decoration. It was survival equipment. Your tomb was a spiritual pantry. A supply depot. A warehouse. And if your tomb was robbed, damaged, or neglected, your ka could suffer. This is why tomb robbery was such a serious crime. Not because it was stealing, but because it was spiritual murder. The ba was your personality, your individuality, your uniqueness. And the ba was often depicted as a bird with a human head. Because Egyptians believed after death, your ba could leave the tomb. It could travel. It could visit places. It could return. But here's the catch. Your ba needed your body. It needed to recognize where to come back to. Which means if your body decomposed, or was destroyed, your ba might not find you. And if your ba couldn't reunite with you, your afterlife would fail. So suddenly, preserving the body becomes a legal requirement for immortality. Not symbolic. Functional. This is why mummification exists. Not as an aesthetic tradition, but as an emergency procedure. Mummification was not honoring the dead. It was making sure the dead didn't become homeless. Because in Egyptian belief, your ba needed a stable address. And that address was your preserved corpse. Now, that is already unsettling. But it gets worse. Because your ba wasn't automatically safe. The afterlife world was full of dangers. Creatures. Demons. Traps. Gates. Guardians. And the ba needed knowledge to survive. Which is why Egyptians were obsessed with spells. Spells weren't for magic tricks. Spells were for navigation. They were for self-defense. They were for passing checkpoints. The afterlife was basically a deadly maze. And the Book of the Dead was the instruction manual. This is where ancient Egypt becomes terrifyingly logical. The Ren was your name. And your name was not just a label. It was a part of your soul. If your name was forgotten, you could die a second death. A permanent one. Which means being remembered wasn't about legacy. It was about survival. Your name needed to be spoken. Written. Carved. Repeated. This is why Egyptians carved names everywhere. Statues. Tomb walls. Coffins. Amulets. Because if someone erased your name, they could erase you. And this was not theoretical. It was weaponized. Pharaohs literally erased the names of their rivals from monuments. Not just to insult them, but to spiritually destroy them. To block them from the afterlife. Imagine a political system where defacing someone's name is equivalent to murdering their soul. That was Egypt. And it wasn't rare. It was policy. So now, not only do you need your body preserved and your ka fed, you need your name protected. Forever. And this is why tombs were hidden. This is why curses were written. This is why tomb walls warn robbers of divine punishment. Because tomb robbery wasn't just theft. It was identity assassination. Egyptians believed your shadow was also part of you. And if that sounds strange, it actually makes sense in their worldview. Your shadow was always with you. It moved when you moved. It was like a silent twin. So of course it must be part of your soul. And shadows were believed to have power. Which is why some tomb art depicts shadows carefully. Because the afterlife was not just about preserving the body. It was about preserving every piece of you. Even the parts you never thought about. The Akh was the final form. The successful form. The version of you that had passed the afterlife trial and become an effective spirit. An Akh was powerful. It could interact with gods. It could influence the living. It could exist in a stable eternal state. But becoming an Akh was not automatic. It was earned. You had to pass judgment. You had to perform rituals. You had to survive the journey. And if you failed, you didn't become an Akh. You became nothing. If all of this already sounds exhausting, congratulations. You have correctly understood the Egyptian afterlife. Because the Egyptian afterlife wasn't restful. It was work. It was effort. It was maintenance. And this is why Egyptians were so obsessed with funerals. Because funerals weren't emotional closure. They were activation ceremonies. A funeral was basically the moment your soul system was launched. Like turning on a machine. And if the funeral was done incorrectly, your soul could malfunction. Let's talk about the funeral. Because this is where Egypt becomes the world's first death industry. And yes, I mean that literally. Modern societies have funeral homes. Ancient Egypt had an entire economy built around death preparation. There were embalmers, priests, tomb builders, painters, carvers, amulet makers, incense sellers, professional mourners. Yes, professional mourners. Women hired to cry dramatically, because tears were part of the ritual. Egyptian funerals were not quiet. They were theatrical. And not because Egyptians were overly emotional. But because funerals were legal proceedings. They were spiritual technology. They were required. And if you were wealthy, you could afford better technology. Better protection. Better spells. Better afterlife chances. And that's where things get a little uncomfortable. Because Egyptian afterlife beliefs were deeply spiritual. But also deeply class-based. Pharaohs had pyramids. Nobles had tombs. Common people had simpler burials. And the quality of your burial could affect your chances. Not in a "God loves the rich" way. But in a practical way. If you can't afford the spells, you might not know the passwords. If you can't afford the amulets, you might not have protection. If you can't afford proper mummification, your body might decay. And if your body decays, your Ba might not recognize it. And if your Ba can't return, your soul system collapses. So yes. In ancient Egypt, the rich had better immortality. And that is one of the most human things ever. Let's talk about mummification. Because most people imagine mummification as some spooky, mysterious, religious process. And it was religious. But it was also extremely practical. And slightly horrifying. Egyptians did not mummify bodies because it looked cool. They mummified bodies because they believed decomposition was a disaster. If your body rotted, your afterlife was at risk. So the Egyptians basically said no. And invented a method to fight nature. Now, the full mummification process was long. Around 70 days in many periods. And it involved steps that are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. First, the body was washed. Then the brain was removed. And yes, removed. Through the nose. Using hooks. The brain was not considered important. It was discarded. Because Egyptians believed thinking and emotion came from the heart. Not the brain. So the heart was preserved. The brain was treated like unwanted packaging. Then the internal organs were removed. Liver. Lungs. Stomach. Intestines. These were preserved separately in canopic jars. Each jar protected by a god. Because even your organs needed divine insurance. The body was then dried with natron salt. Packed. Covered. Drained. Like a piece of meat being prepared for eternity. And once dried, the body was wrapped in linen. Layer after layer. With amulets placed between the wrappings. Spells spoken. Rituals performed. The body became a sacred object. A protected container. Because it wasn't just a corpse. It was your anchor. Your address. Your afterlife home base. Here's the detail that makes this whole thing feel very real. Not all mummifications were perfect. Sometimes embalmers messed up. Sometimes bodies decayed. Sometimes they were rushed. Sometimes they were cheaply done. And the Egyptians knew this. Which means people lived their lives knowing that if they couldn't afford the best burial, their eternity might literally be unstable. Imagine that. Imagine knowing that the quality of your funeral could determine whether you exist after death. That is not comforting. That is terrifying. And yet, Egyptians found it comforting. Because at least there was a system. At least there were rules. At least you could prepare. After the funeral, after the body was placed in the tomb, after the offerings were arranged, the real journey began. The moment the soul woke up. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife stops being beautiful mythology and becomes a horror story with paperwork. Because the dead did not wake up in paradise. They woke up in a dangerous in-between realm. A place called the Duat. And the Duat was not friendly. The Duat was the underworld. Not hell. Not a place of punishment. But a place of passage. A cosmic landscape of darkness, gates, rivers, monsters, and divine officials. The Duat was basically the world between worlds. And you had to cross it. In Egyptian belief, the Duat was also where the sun god Ra traveled every night. Every evening, the sun set. Ra entered the Duat. He traveled through the underworld. He fought chaos. He defeated a giant serpent. And then he rose again at dawn. This was not metaphorical. This was believed to literally happen. Every night. Forever. And the dead were believed to join Ra on this journey. If they were successful. If they were prepared. If they had the right spells. So the afterlife wasn't just you floating in a nice field. It was you traveling with the sun god through a nightmarish cosmic tunnel every night. And if you failed, you could be destroyed. This is not relaxing. This is shift work. Here's where the bureaucracy nightmare becomes very literal. Because the Duat had gates. And these gates had guardians. And the guardians required passwords. Not symbolic passwords. Actual names and phrases you had to know. And if you didn't know them, the gate would not open. And you would be stuck. Or attacked. Or erased. So Egyptians buried the dead with spells. And those spells often included lines like, I know your name. Because in Egyptian magic, knowing the name of something gave you power over it. Names were control. So if you knew the name of the gatekeeper demon, you could pass. If you didn't, you were basically a tourist with no visa. This is why the Book of the Dead exists. And I need you to understand something. The Book of the Dead was not one book. It wasn't a single official text. It was more like a collection. A customizable manual. A set of spells you could purchase. Like buying a spiritual survival guide. You could choose which spells you wanted, depending on your budget and your needs. Which is again, extremely modern. You could be buried with a full deluxe edition. Or a smaller version. Or nothing at all if you were poor. And the spells were written on papyrus and placed in the tomb. Or painted on walls. Or written on coffins. Because the dead needed access to them. Some spells were for protection. Some were for transformation. Yes. Transformation. Because the dead could become different forms in the Duat. A falcon. A lotus. A snake. A heron. Why? Because sometimes you needed to move through obstacles. And being a human soul wasn't always the best shape for the job. So the dead needed spells to change form. Again. This is not peaceful. This is tactical. And then. After you traveled through the Duat. After you passed the gates. After you avoided the monsters. After you navigated the darkness. You arrived at the most famous moment in Egyptian afterlife belief. The judgment. The trial. The weighing of the heart. And this is where Egypt becomes terrifyingly personal. Because the trial wasn't about whether you were powerful. It wasn't about whether you were rich. It wasn't about whether you built temples. It was about whether you lived morally. And not in a vague way. In a checklist way. The gods literally judged you on specific actions. And you had to defend yourself. Not with excuses. Not with speeches. But with a formal declaration. A list of things you claimed you did not do. This was called the negative confession. And it is one of the most fascinating texts in human history. Because it shows us how Egyptians defined morality. Not abstractly. But practically. And it also shows us that the afterlife was not automatic. You had to qualify. Before we get into the full courtroom scene, we need to talk about one more terrifying detail. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of memory and identity. And your heart recorded your life. It remembered everything. So when you stood before the gods, your heart was evidence. And you couldn't lie to it. Which is why Egyptians placed heart amulets on mummies. And why some spells in the Book of the Dead are literally begging your own heart not to betray you. Yes. They wrote spells that basically said, "Please don't snitch on me. Because your heart could testify against you." Imagine that. Imagine living your life believing that your own heart will one day stand in court as a witness. That it will reveal your sins. Your secrets. Your moments of cruelty. Your selfishness. Your lies. And the gods will weigh it. Literally. That belief shapes a society. It shapes behavior. It shapes fear. It shapes what people think matters. And in ancient Egypt, what mattered was not being perfect. It was not being heavy. Because in the judgment scene, your heart was placed on a scale. And on the other side was the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, justice, and cosmic order. And if your heart was heavier than the feather, you failed. And if you failed, a creature called Ammit would eat your heart. Ammit was part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Basically the three most terrifying animals Egyptians knew. Combined into one divine trash compactor. And once Ammit ate your heart, you didn't go to hell. You didn't get tortured. You ceased to exist. You were spiritually annihilated. And that was the worst fate imaginable. Let's pause here for a second. Because we're about to enter the Egyptian afterlife courtroom. And it is one of the most surreal scenes ever created by human imagination. It's like a cosmic trial. With gods as judges. A monster as the executioner. A scribe god writing everything down. And you, a dead person, standing there trying to prove you deserve eternity. And the wildest part? The Egyptians imagined this scene so vividly that they painted it in tombs. They wrote it in papyrus. They made it a standard part of death preparation. Which means people spent their lives knowing that this moment was coming. Not as a metaphor. As a real appointment. Take a deep breath. Get comfortable. Because the next section is where we walk into the courtroom of the gods. And discover that ancient Egyptians basically invented the world's first afterlife audit. Picture it. You are dead. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a screaming, cinematic way. You are dead in the ancient Egyptian way. Quietly. Inevitably. Probably surrounded by family members who are already doing the rituals correctly because they don't want you to become a spiritual disaster. Your body has been prepared. Your tomb has been sealed. Your name has been carved. Offerings have been placed. Spells have been tucked into your wrappings like divine cheat sheets. And now, you wake up. Not in heaven. Not in paradise. You wake up in the Duat. And the Duat is not a place that says, welcome. It is a place that says, proceed. Present credentials. Because in Egyptian belief, death is not a nap. It's a journey. And you don't get to skip the journey. The afterlife is not automatic. It's conditional. It's earned. And you earn it by surviving what comes next. You travel. You move through darkness. You pass gates. You encounter beings that are not exactly friendly. Some are guardians. Some are monsters. Some are divine officials. Some are unclear. Egyptian mythology is full of creatures that are half animal, half god, half nightmare, and fully convinced that your soul is their problem. And you, a newly dead person, have to navigate this landscape. Not with strength. Not with weapons. But with knowledge. With names. With words. With spells. And this is why the Egyptians loved writing. Because writing wasn't just communication. It was survival. Words were power. Names were power. Spells were power. And if you didn't have them, you were basically walking into the most dangerous place imaginable with no map. Eventually, if you're successful, you reach the place that matters most. The place that decides whether you continue. The place that decides whether you become an Ankh. Or whether you are erased. And this place has a name that sounds almost comforting. Almost peaceful. It is called the Hall of Two Truths. And that is the moment when you realize something important. This isn't a battlefield. This isn't a dungeon. This isn't even a mythological wilderness. This is a courtroom. A divine courtroom. And you are the defendant. Let's walk into it. Slowly. Because this is one of the most famous and also one of the most misunderstood scenes in all of ancient history. When people imagine the weighing of the heart, they usually imagine a simple moment. A scale. A feather. A heart. A monster waiting. And a quick verdict. But the Egyptian version of judgment was not quick. It was layered. It was formal. It was procedural. It was full of officials. And it was terrifying because it was so organized. Because if there's one thing scarier than chaos, it's a system. A system that knows what it's doing. The Hall of Two Truths is described as a sacred space in the underworld where judgment happens. And the dead do not enter it alone. They are often guided. Escorted. Brought forward. Because the gods don't want you wandering around unsupervised. And when you arrive, you see them. The judges. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes aggressively intimidating. Because you are not judged by one god. You are judged by many. In some versions, you face 42 divine judges. 42. That is not an accident. That is a number that suggests bureaucracy. That suggests committees. That suggests forms in triplicate. Because the Egyptians weren't interested in one god's opinion. They wanted a panel. A full court. A moral jury. Each judge represents a specific kind of moral law. A specific category of wrongdoing. And the dead must address them. One by one. Which means you don't just show up and hope for the best. You have to make a formal declaration. A statement of innocence. A list of things you claim you did not do. This is the negative confession. And it is one of the most revealing documents we have from ancient Egypt. Because it tells us what Egyptians thought morality was. And it also tells us what they feared being accused of. The negative confession is not one sentence. It's not, I was a good person. It's not, I tried my best. It's not, I'm sorry for my mistakes. No. It is a checklist. A legal style list. It's basically you standing in front of 42 gods and saying, I did not commit this crime. I did not commit that crime. I did not do this. I did not do that. And you do it calmly. Formally. Like someone filing a report. Some of these confessions are what you'd expect. Things like, I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not lied. Normal. Reasonable. But then you get into the more specific ones. The ones that reveal ancient Egyptian society in an almost uncomfortable way. Like, I have not cheated in measurements. This means Egyptians believed cheating customers was a spiritual crime. If you were a merchant and you used a dishonest scale, your heart might become heavier. And that could get you erased. Which is honestly a strong anti-scam policy. Then you get ones like, I have not made anyone weep. Which is fascinating. Because it suggests Egyptians believed cruelty mattered. Not just crimes. Not just violence. But emotional harm. You weren't supposed to cause unnecessary suffering. Then you get. I have not polluted the water. Yes. Ancient Egyptians included environmental ethics in their afterlife checklist. Because water was sacred. The Nile was life. And to pollute it was to disturb Ma'at, the cosmic order. Then you get. I have not stolen from the gods. Which usually means stealing from temples. Because temples were economic centers. They held grain. Gold. Livestock. Offerings. And yes, people stole from them. Then you get. I have not committed adultery. Which is, unsurprising. But then it gets weirder. Because there are confessions like. I have not stopped the flow of water. Which might refer to interfering with irrigation. A huge deal in Egypt. Because irrigation wasn't just farming. It was survival. Then you get. I have not caused terror. I have not acted with violence. I have not been hot-tempered. I have not been arrogant. Now we're entering personality crimes. Not just actions. Temperament. Behavior. The way you treated others. The way you carried yourself. And suddenly you realize. The Egyptian afterlife judgment wasn't just about what you did. It was about what kind of person you were. Which is, a lot. Here's the part that makes it even more intense. You weren't just speaking these confessions. You were expected to know them. To recite them correctly. Because again. The Egyptian afterlife is a system. And systems love precision. Which is why people purchased these confessions in written form. They were included in the Book of the Dead. Because the dead needed a script. And yes. That is literally what this is. The Egyptians wrote a script for the dead to read during their own judgment. Because they believed words had power. And if you said the right words, you could pass. At this point, you might be thinking. So wait, is it about morality or is it about saying the correct spell? And the answer is. Both. Because Egyptian belief didn't separate magic and morality the way modern people do. For Egyptians, the universe ran on order. Ma'at. Truth. Balance. And words were part of maintaining that order. Spells weren't cheating. Spells were participating correctly. In the Hall of Two Truths, there are key figures. Important gods. And each one plays a role like an official in court. The most important is Osiris. Osiris is the Lord of the Dead. The ruler of the underworld. He is often depicted sitting on a throne. Wrapped like a mummy. Holding symbols of kingship. Because Osiris is not just a god. He is a model. A template. He is the god who died and returned. The god who became eternal. Which means if you want to live forever. You want to be like Osiris. And in many texts, the dead are literally called Osiris. Like the deceased becomes an Osiris. A version of him. A member of his realm. Osiris is the judge. But he is not alone. Near him are often Isis and Nephthys. Goddesses associated with protection and mourning. And then there is Thoth. And Thoth is, terrifying in a quiet way. Thoth is the god of writing. Of wisdom. Of record keeping. And in the judgment scene, Thoth stands beside the scales. Holding a scroll. Or a writing palette. And he writes down the verdict. Thoth is the divine clerk. And if you've ever dealt with bureaucracy in real life, you know exactly why this is frightening. Because a judge might be merciful. But a clerk? A clerk writes what happened. A clerk makes it official. A clerk makes it permanent. Thoth is the one who turns your fate into a record. Now. And then there is Anubis. The jackal-headed god. The embalmer. The protector of the dead. Anubis is the one who oversees the weighing. He is the one who brings you forward. He is the one who handles your heart. He is the one who adjusts the scales. Which is both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because he is a guide. Horrifying because he is also the one who decides if the scale is balanced. And then, sitting nearby, waiting, is Amit. The devourer. The eater of hearts. Amit is not a god you worship. Amit is not a god you pray to. Amit is a function. Amit is the consequence. Amit is what happens when you fail. And she sits there like a cosmic recycling bin. Patient. Silent. Not angry. Not emotional. Just waiting. The scale is set. The feather of Ma'at is placed on one side. Your heart is placed on the other. And this is the moment that decides everything. But again. It's not just a scale. It's a concept. Because your heart is believed to contain your deeds. Your truth. Your weight. And Ma'at's feather represents cosmic order. Truth. Balance. Justice. So what's being measured here is not just whether you were good. It's whether you lived in harmony with the universe. Whether you contributed to order. Or whether you fed chaos. If the scale balances, you pass. Your heart is light. Your soul is aligned with Ma'at. And you are declared true of voice. This is an important phrase. True of voice means you have spoken correctly. You have been justified. You are allowed to proceed. And then you can enter the field of reeds. The Egyptian paradise. A version of Egypt itself. A place of eternal agriculture, peace, and stability. Yes. Paradise for Egyptians was basically a well-managed Nile Valley. Because Egyptians didn't dream of escaping their world. They dreamed of their world working perfectly forever. But if the scale tips, if your heart is heavy, if your life has weighed you down, then Amit eats your heart. And you are destroyed. And the reason this is so terrifying is that it's final. No appeal. No second chance. No punishment you can endure and eventually escape. Just deletion. At this point, you might wonder something. And it's a very reasonable question. If the afterlife judgment is so strict, how did anyone pass? How did normal people survive this? How did anyone avoid being erased? And the answer is, Egyptians built in a workaround. Because of course they did. They were not interested in creating a system where everyone fails. They were interested in creating a system where everyone tries. And the workaround was magic, ritual, amulets, spells, and most importantly, the ability to control your heart. Remember earlier when I said Egyptians wrote spells begging their heart not to betray them? This is where that comes in. Because there is a famous spell, often included in the Book of the Dead, called the Heart Scarab spell. A heart scarab was an amulet. A carved beetle, usually green stone, placed over the heart of the mummy. And it had words carved on it. Words that were meant to command the heart. To silence it. To prevent it from speaking against you. And the text basically says, "O my heart, do not stand against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal." In other words, heart, don't ruin this for me. Which is one of the most human sentences ever written. This is not just superstition. It's evidence that Egyptians understood something uncomfortable. People are complicated. People make mistakes. People aren't perfectly moral. And yet people still want eternity. So Egypt created a system where morality mattered. But ritual could help. Because the afterlife wasn't just a moral test. It was also a technical process. A process where you needed tools. This is where Egyptian religion becomes almost practical. Because if you were worried about judgment, you could do things in life to improve your chances. You could give offerings. You could build temples. You could donate to priests. You could commission rituals. You could prepare your tomb properly. You could buy a book of the dead. You could wear protective amulets. You could pay for prayers. You could hire priests to perform rituals after your death. Because Egyptians believed the living could help the dead. Which means death was not a private event. It was a social responsibility. If your family abandoned your tomb, you could weaken. If they forgot your name, you could fade. If they stopped making offerings, your ka could starve. So the afterlife was not just about you. It was about your community continuing to support you. Which is both comforting and stressful. Comforting because you're not alone. Stressful because your immortality depends on other people staying consistent for centuries. And humans are not known for that. So, you pass judgment. You are declared true of voice. Your heart is safe. Amit does not get a snack. Thoth records your success. Osiris approves. And now, you can enter paradise. Right? Now you can finally rest. Now you can relax. Now you can float peacefully in eternal bliss. No. Of course not. Because ancient Egypt does not do simple. Egypt does not do rest. Egypt does not do, and they lived happily ever after. Egypt does. Congratulations. Your paperwork is approved. Now report for duty. Because the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, was not heaven. It was not clouds. It was not eternal singing. It was not sitting on a golden throne doing nothing. It was farming. I am not joking. Paradise in Egypt was agriculture. A perfect version of Egypt, with canals and fields and crops. A place where the Nile floods exactly as it should. Where food grows endlessly. Where your family is there. Where your home exists. Where everything is stable. But you still have to work. Before you panic. Egyptians didn't imagine this work as suffering. They imagined it as meaningful. As orderly. As part of Ma'at. They believed the perfect life was a life where things functioned. Where the land was fertile. Where society was stable. Where people did their roles. And so paradise was not escape. It was continuation. But here's the catch. Even paradise had bureaucracy. Even paradise had labor. Even paradise required effort. Because Egyptians believed the dead still needed to eat. Still needed shelter. Still needed protection. Still needed to exist correctly. And this is where we meet one of the most adorable and also deeply unsettling objects in Egyptian tombs. Ashabti. Ashabti were small figurines. Often made of wood, stone, or faience. Little servant statues. And they were placed in tombs in large numbers. Sometimes dozens. Sometimes hundreds. Sometimes over 400. Because in the afterlife, you might be called to do work. And if you were called, your Ashabti would answer for you. They were basically afterlife labor substitutes. Tiny magical workers. Their job was to say, "Here I am." And do the farming. Do the canal digging. Do the labor. So you could relax. Which means Egyptians literally invented afterlife outsourcing. And again, this is extremely modern. Now, Ashabti often had spells written on them. Instructions. Because they weren't just decorative. They were functional. They were magical employees. And the dead needed them. Especially wealthy people. Because wealthy people did not want to spend eternity digging canals. They wanted eternity with the same lifestyle they had in life. So they brought servants. In statue form. This is where the Egyptian afterlife reveals something uncomfortable. The afterlife was not imagined as a place where society became equal. It was imagined as a place where society continued. Where hierarchy continued. Where class continued. Where the rich stayed rich. And the poor stayed poor. But with more gods. If you're listening to this while falling asleep, you might be thinking. This is insane. Why would anyone want this? And the answer is. Because for Egyptians, the alternative was worse. Non-existence. Chaos. Being eaten. Being lost in darkness. So even a bureaucratic afterlife was better than nothing. Even a paradise with labor was better than erasure. But we're not done. Because there's another layer to Egyptian afterlife belief that is even stranger. And it has to do with time. Because Egyptians did not imagine eternity as static. They imagined it as cyclical. Like the sun. Every day the sun rose. Every day it set. Every night it traveled through the duat. Every morning it returned. And the dead were believed to participate in this cycle. Which means the afterlife wasn't one long peaceful day. It was an endless rhythm. An endless repetition. A cosmic schedule. And again. This is not restful. This is structured. And here's the detail that makes this even more intense. Egyptians believed the dead could be threatened even after judgment. Even after entering paradise. Because chaos never stops trying to break order. The serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, attacked Ra every night. And the dead who traveled with Ra were part of the defense. Which means the afterlife wasn't just paradise. It was also cosmic warfare. Every night. Forever. So yes. The Egyptian afterlife included nightly serpent battles. And if that sounds exhausting. It is. But Egyptians didn't see it as exhausting. They saw it as necessary. Because without that battle, the sun wouldn't rise. Order would collapse. Reality would dissolve. So the dead were not just resting. They were maintaining the universe. This is the point where you realize something. Ancient Egyptians did not believe humans were small. They believed humans mattered. They believed the actions of the dead mattered. They believed the dead were part of cosmic stability. Which is why their funerary religion was so intense. Because death wasn't an end. It was a promotion. A new role. A new responsibility. There is one more terrifying truth about the Egyptian afterlife. And it's one that most people don't think about. The Egyptian afterlife required constant maintenance. Your tomb had to remain intact. Your name had to remain visible. Offerings had to continue. Rituals had to be performed. And if your tomb was destroyed, your afterlife could be threatened. This is why tombs were hidden. This is why curses were written. This is why Egyptians were paranoid about robbers. Because robbers weren't just stealing gold. They were interfering with eternity. And this brings us to one of the most haunting realities of ancient Egypt. Most people did not get the perfect afterlife. Not because they were immoral. But because time is cruel. Tombs collapse. Floods happen. Graves are robbed. Names are forgotten. Families die out. Offerings stop. And the afterlife, in Egyptian belief, could weaken over time. Which means the Egyptians were trying to build something impossible. A system that required permanence. In a world where nothing stays permanent. And that tension is what makes Egyptian funerary culture so intense. They were fighting time. Fighting decay. Fighting forgetting. Fighting chaos. And they were doing it with stone, ritual, and writing. So far, we've walked through the soul system, the duat, the hall of two truths, the weighing of the heart, paradise as farming, Ashabti as afterlife labor, and the endless cosmic schedule. But we haven't yet explored the most unsettling part. The part that turns the Egyptian afterlife into a true nightmare. Because it wasn't just about passing judgment. It was about surviving the journey. And the journey was filled with things that wanted to stop you. Not because they were evil. But because that's how the system worked. The duat was full of gatekeepers, guardians, and beings that tested you. And to pass them, you needed passwords. Names. Spells. And this is where the Book of the Dead becomes less like a holy text. And more like a survival manual written by someone who has seen things. Now. We've reached the point where most people, if they were being honest, would say, okay. I understand the judgment. I understand the scales. I understand the heart and the feather. I understand the fear of being erased. And that's fair. Because the judgment scene is the famous part. It's the part that gets painted. It's the part that gets printed in books. It's the part that ends up on museum posters. But the Egyptian afterlife is not just a courtroom. It's a journey. And the journey is the part that quietly turns this entire belief system into something deeply unsettling. Because the duat, the underworld, was not designed to be welcoming. It was designed to be a test. Not just of morality. But of knowledge. And the duat was full of things that did not care whether you were tired. Which, unfortunately, is extremely on brand for bureaucracy. Because a system doesn't care if you're exhausted. It only cares if you follow procedure. In Egyptian texts, the duat is described as a strange landscape. A world beneath the world. A place of darkness, rivers, caverns, gates, islands, lakes, and shifting regions. Sometimes it looks like a tunnel. Sometimes it looks like a vast desert. Sometimes it looks like a cosmic river system. Sometimes it looks like a series of chambers. And that's because the Egyptian afterlife wasn't a single consistent map. It evolved over thousands of years. Different dynasties imagined it differently. Different priests described it differently. Different regions had different traditions. But one thing remains constant across almost all versions. The duat is dangerous. Not because it's evil. But because it's full of obstacles. And the dead are not automatically safe. They are tested. Challenged. Threatened. Stopped. And to survive, they must prove they belong. Here's a detail that makes this feel almost painfully modern. In the duat, you don't just walk forward. You encounter gates. And at each gate, there is a guard. And the guard asks you questions. Or demands your name. Or demands the name of the gate itself. Or demands the name of the bolt. Or the name of the door. Or the name of the hinge. Yes. Sometimes you have to know the name of the hinge. Because the Egyptians believed everything had a name. And names had power. So if you knew the name, you could pass. If you didn't, you couldn't. This is the Egyptian afterlife in its purest form. A spiritual escape room. The Book of the Dead contains spells for this. Spells that begin with lines like, I know you. I know your name. I know the name of this gate. I know the name of the one who guards it. And these spells were not written for fun. They were written because people believed without them, you would be stuck. Or attacked. Or destroyed. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes incredibly vivid. Because the guardians aren't vague. They aren't shadowy demons. They are described, named, characterized. Some have animal heads. Some have knives. Some breathe fire. Some have strange titles like He who lives on serpents. She who eats filth. The one who swallows sinners. Which is not comforting. And again, notice something. These beings don't sound like random monsters. They sound like employees. Like their job is to do one thing. To enforce a rule. To punish a mistake. To test you. Which makes the do it feel less like a mythological underworld and more like a spiritual security checkpoint system. Let's imagine what this would actually feel like. Because this is the part that is easy to miss if you treat it like mythology. If you were an ancient Egyptian, you grew up hearing about the do-it. You heard about the gates. You heard about the guardians. You heard about the spells. And you knew that one day, you would be there. Alone. Dead. In darkness. Facing beings who do not care about your excuses. And you knew the only thing that would protect you was what you had memorized. Or what had been buried with you. That's not comforting. That's terrifying. It means death was not a relief. Death was a test you had been studying for your entire life. And here's where things get even stranger. Because the do-it wasn't just dangerous. It was weird. The Egyptian underworld is filled with images that feel almost surreal. Like something from a dream. Or a nightmare. There are rivers of fire. Lakes of flame. Fields of knives. Caverns where gods sleep. Regions where souls are upside down. Places where the dead are punished by being forced to eat their own filth. Yes. Egyptian texts contain punishments that are graphic. And very specific. But the do-it is not just punishment. It's also transformation. Because the dead, if they had the right spells, could become powerful. They could become like gods. They could become part of Ra's boat. They could become an Ankh. They could gain the ability to move freely. To fly. To take different forms. To speak with authority. And this is why Egyptian afterlife belief is so complicated. Because it's not purely scary. It's also empowering. The do-it is dangerous. But it's also a place where you can become something more. If you succeed. So the Book of the Dead includes spells for protection. But also spells for transformation. Spells that say, I become a falcon. I become a lotus. I become a heron. I become a serpent. Which makes the do-it feel less like a mythological underworld and more like a spiritual security checkpoint system. Let's imagine what this would actually feel like. Because this is the part that is easy to miss if you treat it like mythology. If you were an ancient Egyptian, you grew up hearing about the do-it. You heard about the gates. You heard about the guardians. You heard about the spells. And you knew that one day, you would be there. Alone. Dead. In darkness. Facing beings who do not care about your excuses. And you knew the only thing that would protect you was what you had memorized. Or what had been buried with you. That's not comforting. That's terrifying. It means death was not a relief. Death was a test you had been studying for your entire life. And here's where things get even stranger. Because the do-it wasn't just dangerous. It was weird. The Egyptian underworld is filled with images that feel almost surreal. Like something from a dream. Or a nightmare. There are rivers of fire. Lakes of flame. Fields of knives. Caverns where gods sleep. Regions where souls are upside down. Places where the dead are punished by being forced to eat their own filth. Yes. Egyptian texts contain punishments that are graphic. And very specific. But the do-it is not just punishment. It's also transformation. Because the dead, if they had the right spells, could become powerful. They could become like gods. They could become part of Ra's boat. They could become an Ankh. They could gain the ability to move freely. To fly. To take different forms. To speak with authority. And this is why Egyptian afterlife belief is so complicated. Because it's not purely scary. It's also empowering. The do-it is dangerous. But it's also a place where you can become something more. If you succeed. So the Book of the Dead includes spells for protection. But also spells for transformation. Spells that say, I become a falcon. I become a lotus. I become a heron. I become a serpent. I become a divine being. And these spells weren't symbolic. They were functional. Because the do-it was full of obstacles. And sometimes you needed to fly. Sometimes you needed to slip through cracks. Sometimes you needed to hide. Sometimes you needed to fight. So you changed form. And yes, this sounds like fantasy. But in Egyptian thought, this wasn't fantasy. This was reality. Because reality was spiritual. Reality was layered. The world of the gods was not separate from the world of humans. It overlapped. It interacted. And death was the moment you crossed deeper into it. Now. Let's talk about the most famous journey in the do-it. The journey of Ra. Because the Egyptian afterlife is not just you traveling. It's you traveling with the sun. Every night, Ra traveled through 12 hours of the underworld. 12 regions. 12 stages. 12 zones. And each one had dangers. Each one had enemies. Each one had beings who supported him. And the dead could join this journey. If they were successful. If they were justified. If they were prepared. In many texts, Ra travels on a boat. A solar bark. And this boat is not peaceful. It is guarded. It is armed. It is full of gods and spirits who protect it. Because every night, Ra is attacked by Apophis. The great serpent of chaos. A being whose entire purpose is to stop the sun from rising. To stop time. To stop order. To collapse the universe into darkness. And this is important. Because Apophis isn't just a monster. Apophis is chaos itself. He is the enemy of Ma'at. He is the enemy of stability. And Egyptians believed this battle was real. Every night. Forever. Which means the universe was never secure. It had to be defended. Constantly. And the dead were part of that defense. This changes the meaning of the afterlife. Because it means the afterlife wasn't just about personal survival. It was about cosmic responsibility. If you became an Ankh, you weren't just living forever. You were helping maintain the universe. Which is a lot to put on someone who just died. But again, Egyptians loved order. They loved structure. They loved roles. They loved systems. So this idea that the dead continue working wasn't depressing. It was meaningful. It meant you still mattered. You still had purpose. You were still part of Ma'at. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes almost comforting. Because despite the monsters and the gates and the trials, the underlying message is, you can survive. You can become eternal. You can be part of something bigger. But only if you do it correctly. Let's zoom in on the gates. Because the gates are where the bureaucracy nightmare really shines. Egyptian texts describe gates with names. Each gate has a name. Each guardian has a name. Each bolt has a name. Each doorkeeper has a name. And sometimes the names are poetic. Sometimes they are terrifying. Sometimes they are just bizarre. And you, the dead person, must address them properly. Imagine this. You approach a gate. The gate is massive. It glows. Or it is carved in darkness. A guardian stands before it. The guardian is not human. It has the head of an animal. Or the face of a god. Or knives for hands. Or eyes that burn. And it says, "Who are you?" And you must respond. Not with fear. Not with panic. Not with, "Please let me through." But with the correct formal statement. You must say your name. Your titles. Your identity. And then you must say, "I know your name." Because if you know the name of the guardian, you have authority. If you don't know the name, you are powerless. And the guardian can stop you. Or attack you. Or deny you passage. Now, this is where the Book of the Dead becomes absolutely essential. Because the spells in it are basically a list of cheat codes. A list of dialogues. A list of responses. And Egyptians believed that if you had the spell written near you, you could use it. Even if you hadn't memorized it. Because writing itself had power. Which is a lot to put on someone who just died. But again, Egyptians loved order. They loved structure. They loved roles. They loved systems. So this idea that the dead continue working wasn't depressing. It was meaningful. It meant you still mattered. You still had purpose. You were still part of Ma'at. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes almost comforting. Because despite the monsters and the gates and the trials, the underlying message is, you can survive. You can become eternal. You can be part of something bigger. But only if you do it correctly. Let's zoom in on the gates. Because the gates are where the bureaucracy nightmare really shines. Egyptian texts describe gates with names. Each gate has a name. Each guardian has a name. Each bolt has a name. Each doorkeeper has a name. And sometimes the names are poetic. Sometimes they are terrifying. Sometimes they are just bizarre. And you, the dead person, must address them properly. Imagine this. You approach a gate. The gate is massive. It glows. Or it is carved in darkness. A guardian stands before it. The guardian is not human. It has the head of an animal. Or the face of a god. Or knives for hands. Or eyes that burn. And it says, "Who are you?" And you must respond. Not with fear. Not with panic. Not with, "Please let me through." But with the correct formal statement. You must say your name. Your titles. Your identity. And then you must say, "I know your name." Because if you know the name of the guardian, you have authority. If you don't know the name, you are powerless. And the guardian can stop you. Or attack you. Or deny you passage. Now, this is where the Book of the Dead becomes absolutely essential. Because the spells in it are basically a list of cheat codes. A list of dialogues. A list of responses. And Egyptians believed that if you had the spell written near you, you could use it. Even if you hadn't memorized it. Because writing itself had power. This is why tomb texts were so important. This is why coffins were covered in writing. Because writing wasn't decoration. It was functionality. It was insurance. And yes, this means literacy was power. But most Egyptians weren't literate. Which means they relied on priests and scribes. They relied on professionals. The death industry again. You paid someone to write the spells for you. You paid someone to paint them. You paid someone to carve them. Because your survival depended on it. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Not all books of the dead were perfect. Some contain errors, misspellings, wrong names, mistakes. And those mistakes mattered. Because if you got the name wrong, would the guardian accept it? Would the spell work? Would the gate open? We don't know. But Egyptians were terrified of this possibility. Which is why scribes were respected. Because scribes weren't just writers. They were spiritual technicians. They were programming your afterlife. Now, there's another aspect of the Duat that is often overlooked. The Duat wasn't just a place you traveled through. It was also a place where you could be judged repeatedly. Not just once. Because the Egyptian afterlife had layers. There was the main judgment. The weighing of the heart. But there were also other tests. Other encounters. Other moments where you could fail. Which means even after passing the courtroom, you still had to survive the system. This is why the Egyptian afterlife feels like a maze. A maze with traps. And the traps aren't always physical. Sometimes they are psychological. Sometimes they are moral. Sometimes they are about identity. Because the Duat is a place where the dead can lose themselves. They can become confused. They can forget their names. They can be tricked. They can be swallowed. They can be bound. They can be turned upside down. They can be trapped in darkness. And again, the worst fate isn't torture. It's dissolution. It's losing yourself. It's becoming a wandering soul. A restless spirit. A ghost. And Egyptians feared this. They feared becoming a spirit that could not reach the afterlife. A spirit that haunted the living. Not because it wanted to. But because it had failed. This is where Egyptian funerary religion becomes almost compassionate. Because it wasn't just about the dead. It was also about protecting the living from the dead. Because a restless spirit was dangerous. Not necessarily evil. But unstable. Hungry. Angry. Lost. So funerals were also about making sure the dead were properly processed. So they didn't come back. Now. This is the part where you start to realize something. Egyptians were not obsessed with death because they loved death. They were obsessed with death because they were afraid of it. Not the moment of dying. But the consequences. The uncertainty. The possibility of being lost. So they built a system. A detailed, structured, ritualized system. And systems make people feel safe. Even if the system is terrifying. And here's the final detail that makes the Duat feel like a true bureaucracy nightmare. The dead are constantly required to identify themselves. To declare who they are. To prove they belong. To say their names. To say their lineage. To say their titles. To say their purity. Because in Egyptian belief, identity was fragile after death. Your soul could be scattered. Your parts could separate. Your ba could wander. Your ka could weaken. Your name could be forgotten. Your body could decay. So the Duat is full of moments where you must reinforce your identity. Like a person constantly showing ID at checkpoints. And if you fail, you could lose yourself. You could become a shadow. A ghost. A forgotten thing. So the Book of the Dead isn't just spells. It's identity reinforcement. It's a script that keeps you coherent. It keeps you, you. We've covered the Duat as a journey. The gates. The guardians. The passwords. The cosmic boat. The serpent battle. The transformation spells. But there's another layer to this story. A layer that makes the Egyptian afterlife not just weird, but emotionally powerful. Because the Egyptian afterlife wasn't just about fear. It was about love. Family. memory, and the desperate human need to not be forgotten. Because Egyptians believed remembrance was survival. And that means the living had a responsibility. A sacred duty. To remember the dead. To speak their names. To bring offerings. To maintain tombs. To keep them alive. And that is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes less like mythology. And more like a mirror. Because even today, humans fear being forgotten. We fear our lives meaning nothing. We fear disappearing. And Egypt took that fear. And turned it into architecture. Into writing. Into stone. Into ritual. Into a system designed to fight forgetting. If you've ever filled out a form, and halfway through, you realized you don't actually know what they're asking, and you're not sure if you're doing it wrong, and you suddenly feel a quiet, creeping fear that this one mistake could ruin everything, then congratulations. You already understand the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Because what most people imagine is, oh, it's a holy book. Like a Bible. Like a Quran. Like a single, fixed text. A sacred scripture. Something standardized. Something consistent. Something you can quote. But the Book of the Dead was not that. Not even close. The Book of the Dead was a product. A customizable product. A spiritual toolkit. A funeral service upgrade. A luxury item. A set of instructions. That you could buy. And yes. That means the Egyptian afterlife had a market. It had pricing. It had quality. It had expensive versions. It had cheap versions. It had scribes who did careful work. And scribes who did sloppy work. And scribes who probably overcharged people. Because what are you going to do? Complain. You're dead. The Book of the Dead is actually a modern name. Egyptians didn't call it the Book of the Dead. That title was given by scholars much later. The Egyptians called it something closer to the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Which is such a beautiful phrase. And also, quietly terrifying. Because it implies something. It implies you are trapped somewhere. And you need a book. To come forth. So what was it? The Book of the Dead was a collection of spells. And I mean that literally. Not prayers. Not poetry. Spells. Magical instructions. Protective formulas. Declarations. Commands. And these spells were written on papyrus scrolls. Sometimes very long. Sometimes short. Sometimes beautifully illustrated. Sometimes barely readable. Sometimes copied with care. Sometimes copied with mistakes. And each scroll was unique. This is important. There was no single official Book of the Dead. Instead, there was a menu of spells. And depending on your wealth. And your region. And the scribe you hired. You might get a different selection. So one person might have spell 125, the famous judgment scene. Another person might not. Someone might have extra spells for transformation. Someone might have extra spells for protection against snakes. Someone might have spells for crossing water. Someone might have spells for opening gates. Someone might have spells for making sure their mouth works. Yes. There were spells for that. Because Egyptians feared a very specific thing. Being dead, and unable to speak. Unable to eat. Unable to breathe. Unable to move. Unable to function. This is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes extremely physical. Because they didn't imagine the afterlife as a floating ghost realm. They imagined it as real. You needed senses. You needed limbs. You needed a mouth. You needed eyes. You needed strength. So if your body was damaged, or your tomb was robbed, or your mummy was broken, it could affect your afterlife. And that's why there are spells like spell for opening the mouth, spell for giving the deceased power over their legs, spell for giving the deceased power over their arms, spell for not letting the heart be taken, spell for not letting the head be cut off. Yes. That last one is real. Imagine living your life knowing you might need a spell, so your head doesn't get cut off. In the underworld. That's not peaceful. That's survival horror. So how did people get a book of the dead? They hired a scribe. And this is one of the most fascinating details. Because it means there were workshops. Funerary papyrus workshops. Where scribes produced these scrolls. And sometimes they didn't even make them for a specific person at first. They made them in advance. Like pre-made templates. And then later. They would write your name in. Like a blank space. So imagine the scene. A person dies. The family is grieving. They are panicking. They are trying to arrange the funeral. They are trying to preserve the body. They are trying to pay for the tomb. And now they also need the paperwork. The spells. The scroll. So they go to a workshop. And the workshop says, okay. What package do you want? And yes, I'm exaggerating slightly. But not much. Because some scrolls are clearly mass-produced. They have the same illustrations. The same layout. The same sequence of spells. Which means scribes had standard designs. And then they customized them. And if you were rich, you could get a scroll with beautiful colored illustrations. Detailed vignettes. Gilded sections. Fine handwriting. High-quality papyrus. If you were less rich, you might get a simpler version. If you were poor, you might not get one at all. Or you might get only a few spells written on linen. Or on your coffin. Or on a small piece of papyrus. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes brutally unfair. Because the afterlife was not equal. The afterlife was easier. If you were wealthy. Because wealth bought protection. Wealth bought spells. Wealth bought skilled scribes. Wealth bought tombs. Wealth bought priests to perform rituals. Wealth bought offerings. Wealth bought memory. And if you were poor, you still believed in the afterlife. You still feared the do-it. You still wanted to survive. But you had fewer resources. So you relied on simpler protections. You relied on community. You relied on local rituals. You relied on cheaper versions of texts. This is why the Book of the Dead is so important for historians. Because it reveals something. It reveals that ancient Egyptian religion was not just spiritual. It was economic. It was social. It was an industry. Now let's open the book. Because the spells inside it are, honestly, unbelievable. Some are poetic. Some are beautiful. Some are moral. Some are terrifying. Some are deeply practical. And some are so specific that they feel like they were written after someone had a very bad dream and refused to ever risk it again. One of the most famous spells, besides the judgment scene, is the heart scarab spell. This is the spell that says, "Oh my heart, do not stand against me." Because remember, your heart is tested. But your heart is also dangerous. Because the heart can betray you. Now. This is such a strange concept. In most religions, your conscience is your friend. Your inner self is your truth. But in Egypt, your inner self could ruin you. Because the heart holds your memories. Your sins. your hidden actions, your secret thoughts. And during judgment, it is weighed. So Egyptians wanted to control it. They wanted to stop it from speaking. Yes. They feared their own heart would testify. So they wrote spells to silence it. They placed heart scarabs on the mummy. And the scarab often had the spell inscribed. It was basically a magical gag order for your conscience. That is one of the most unsettling ideas in ancient religion. Because it implies something. It implies people believed. I am not just judged by my actions. I am judged by what my heart remembers. So I must make my heart cooperate. Now let's talk about another spell. A spell for not being eaten. Because yes. The underworld had predators. And not symbolic ones. Real ones. Monsters. Serpents. Crocodiles. Beings with knives. Beings with fire. Beings who devour souls. So there are spells that say, I will not be eaten. I am not food. I am not for your jaws. Which is, grim. Because it means the afterlife wasn't a peaceful garden by default. It was a place where you could be hunted. Now. Another famous spell is the one for turning into a bird. Because the Ba is often shown as a bird with a human head. And the idea was, your Ba could fly out of the tomb. It could visit the living. It could travel. It could move between worlds. This is one of the most human parts of Egyptian belief. Because it suggests the dead still cared. They still wanted to see their homes. Their families. Their gardens. Their temples. Their cities. They still wanted to be part of life. And this is why tombs were filled with scenes of daily life. Food. Farming. Fishing. Feasting. Music. Family. Because the tomb wasn't just a grave. It was a continuation. A home. A place where the dead could return. But again. Only if the system worked. Only if the spells worked. Only if the offerings came. Only if the name was spoken. Only if the tomb survived. And this brings us to one of the darkest realities. Tomb robbing. Because the entire Egyptian afterlife depended on tomb integrity. The body had to remain. The name had to remain. The spells had to remain. The offerings had to continue. And tomb robbers destroyed that. So tomb robbing wasn't just theft. It was spiritual murder. It was the destruction of someone's eternity. This is why tomb curses exist. Not because Egyptians believed curses were dramatic. But because they needed deterrence. They needed threats. Because if someone broke into your tomb, they weren't just stealing gold. They were breaking your afterlife. Now let's go back to the spells again. Because I want to show you something. The Book of the Dead contains spells that feel like bureaucratic procedures. For example, there are spells for entering certain regions. Spells for crossing water. Spells for opening gates. Spells for speaking to specific guardians. Spells for passing specific beings. Now. And each spell often begins with a statement. I am. I am the one who. I have. I know. Because identity is everything. Authority is everything. In the do it, you don't beg. You don't plead. You don't cry. You declare. You assert. You command. And this is where Egyptian afterlife magic feels like law. Like legal language. Like contracts. Because spells aren't emotional. They are procedural. They are instructions. They are formulas. They are code. And yes, that means the Egyptian afterlife was basically A legal system run by gods. Let's talk about the most unsettling spells. Because there are spells that reveal the fear Egyptians had about death. And one of the biggest fears was losing the body. You might think. But you're dead. Why does the body matter? Because in Egypt, the body was the anchor. It was the stable point. Your Ka needed it. Your Ba needed it. Your identity needed it. So if the body decayed, or was destroyed, you could become unstable. So there are spells for not letting the body decay, not letting the bones be scattered, not letting the head be separated, not letting the limbs be taken. This is why mummification was so important. Because mummification wasn't just preservation. It was afterlife security. And here's the part that people often don't realize. Mummification was not perfect. It was not always successful. Bodies could still rot. They could still be damaged. They could still be eaten by insects. They could still be flooded. They could still be burned. They could still be broken. So the Egyptians were not blindly confident. They were anxious. They were trying to control the uncontrollable. Now, one of the most famous rituals connected to all this is the opening of the mouth ceremony. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife becomes almost cinematic. Because this ceremony was performed on the mummy, or on a statue, or on a funerary mask. And the purpose was to restore the senses. To give the dead the ability to speak. To breathe. To eat. To see. To hear. To function. The priest would use ritual tools. Sometimes shaped like an adze. And they would touch the mouth. The eyes. The ears. And speak formulas. To modern eyes, it looks symbolic. But to Egyptians, it was literal. It was activating the dead. It was switching them on. Which again is terrifying. Because it implies a dead person without this ritual was not fully alive in the afterlife. They were incomplete, mute, blind, trapped. And that brings us to something very important. The Egyptian afterlife was not automatic. It was engineered. It was built. It was constructed through ritual. Through spells. Through offerings. Through memory. Through writing. Through preservation. So in Egypt, death wasn't the end. But it also wasn't a simple continuation. It was a project. A long project. A project that involved your family. Your priests. Your tomb. Your community. Your money. Your name. Your body. Your gods. And the more you look at it, the more you realize. Egyptian afterlife belief is basically a massive system designed to fight entropy. To fight decay. To fight forgetting. To fight chaos. To fight time. Which is why Ma'at is so central. Because Ma'at is order. Ma'at is balance. Ma'at is stability. And the afterlife is the ultimate test of whether you belong in that order. There is a comforting lie we tell ourselves about death. A modern lie. A simple one. It goes like this. When you die, your story is finished. And that's it. No more paperwork. No more bills. No more responsibilities. No more stress. You are gone. The living handle the rest. Ancient Egypt did not believe that. Ancient Egypt believed something much worse. They believed death is not the end of responsibility. Death is the beginning of dependence. Because even if you survived the duat, even if you passed judgment, even if your heart was light, you still had one massive weakness. You needed the living. You needed offerings. You needed rituals. You needed your name spoken. You needed your tomb maintained. You needed your memory kept alive. And if the living stopped, you could fade. You could weaken. You could starve. You could become restless. You could become nothing. So the Egyptian afterlife was not just a spiritual test. It was a long-term subscription. And your family was responsible for renewing it. This is one of the most quietly terrifying things about their worldview. Because it means your eternity could be ruined. Not by your sins, but by your descendants being lazy, or poor, or dead, or moving away, or simply forgetting. Imagine spending your entire life preparing for the afterlife. Saving money, commissioning a tomb, buying spells, paying priests, mummifying your body, doing everything correctly, passing judgment, reaching the field of reeds. And then, 200 years later, your great-great-great-grandchildren stop visiting. They stop leaving bread. They stop pouring beer. They stop lighting incense. And you begin to fade. That's not heaven. That's a hostage situation. This is why tomb inscriptions are so desperate sometimes. Not always grand. Not always regal. Sometimes they are pleading. Sometimes they are basically emotional blackmail carved into stone. There are tomb texts that say things like, "O living one who passes by, say my name," or "Give me water," or "Leave an offering," or "If you do this, the gods will favor you." This is the ancient equivalent of leaving a note on your grave that says, "If you don't bring me snacks, I will haunt you." And it wasn't just fear. It was logic. Because the dead still needed sustenance. They still needed energy. They still needed nourishment. The offerings were food and drink. Bread. Beer. Meat. Fruit. Vegetables. Incense. Oil. Flowers. But here's the thing. The dead weren't literally eating the physical food. They were consuming the spiritual essence. The Ka was fed by offerings. So the family would bring bread. And then later, they might eat the bread themselves. Which is a fascinating detail. Because it means offerings were not always wasted. The ritual fed the dead spiritually. And fed the living physically. This also created an entire economy around tombs. Priests. Servants. Workers. Tomb caretakers. People paid to maintain offerings. And if you were wealthy enough, you could hire priests to do this for you forever. Like a permanent contract. A funerary endowment. But again, this is where wealth matters. Because if you were poor, your family might not be able to keep it up. And this is one reason Egyptians feared dying childless. Because who would maintain your tomb? Who would speak your name? Who would bring offerings? So having children was not just social. It was eternal survival planning. And this is where Egyptian religion becomes extremely human. Because beneath the gods and spells, it is a system built on one basic fear. Being forgotten. Not dying. Not judgment. Not monsters. Not snakes. For many Egyptians, the worst possible fate was to disappear. To fade out of memory. To have your name erased. Because name was not just a label. The name was part of your soul. Your identity. Your existence. And if your name was destroyed, you could be destroyed. This is why Egyptians hated damnatio memoriae. The deliberate erasing of names. Chiseling names off monuments. Scraping names from tomb walls. Destroying inscriptions. Because that wasn't just political. It was spiritual murder. And yes, this happened. Especially in royal contexts. Especially when a ruler became unpopular. Or when a successor wanted to rewrite history. The most famous example is probably Akhenaten. But this practice existed widely. So the afterlife wasn't just threatened by nature. Or tomb robbers. Or Rome. It was threatened by politics. If someone wanted to destroy you, they didn't have to kill you. They could erase your name. Which is why writing was sacred. Which is why hieroglyphs were powerful. Which is why tombs were covered in inscriptions. And this leads us to another deeply unsettling thing. Egyptians were obsessed with redundancy. Because they knew systems fail. Bodies decay. Tombs collapse. Offerings stop. Names fade. So they built backup plans. This is why you see the same spells repeated. The same names written multiple times. The same titles listed over and over. The same scenes painted in multiple places. It's not because they were artistic and poetic. It's because they were paranoid. They were building an afterlife that could survive disaster. And they had reason. Because Egypt itself was not stable forever. Dynasties rose and fell. Wars happened. Foreign invasions happened. Temples were destroyed. Priesthoods changed. Cities shifted. So Egyptians were trying to build eternity. In a world that constantly reminded them. Nothing lasts. Let's talk about the field of reeds. Because if you pass judgment. If you survive the duat. This is where you end up. And most people imagine it as paradise. Heaven. A peaceful place. And yes, it is paradise. But it's a very Egyptian paradise. Which means it involves work. This is the funniest part. Because in many modern religions, paradise means no labor. No suffering. No struggle. No chores. Egyptian paradise was basically a perfect version of Egypt. Fields. Canals. Crops. Harvests. Fishing. Boats. Gardens. And yes, you were expected to farm. Not constantly. Not brutally. But the field of reeds was a place where you lived as an idealized Egyptian. You had land. You had food. You had abundance. You had peace. But you still participated in the rhythms of life. And here's where Egyptians got clever. Because they realized something. Even in paradise. You might not want to do manual labor forever. So they invented a solution. A magical loophole. A spiritual hack. The shabdi. Or a shabdi. These were small figurines placed in tombs. Sometimes a few. Sometimes dozens. Sometimes hundreds. They were servants. But not physical servants. They were magical servants. They were meant to come alive in the afterlife. And if the gods called you to work, the shabdi would answer for you. They would say, "Here I am." And do the labor in your place. So yes. The Egyptian afterlife had paperwork. Trials. Monsters. Gatekeepers. Moral judgment. Eternal farming. And magical substitute workers. Which makes it feel less like heaven. And more like a cosmic civilization simulator. And the shabdi were not symbolic toys. They were legally binding. Many shabdi have inscriptions. Spells. Instructions. They often include a specific spell from the Book of the Dead. So you weren't just placing figurines. You were signing contracts. If you were wealthy, you could afford many shabdi. If you were extremely wealthy, You could afford a full set. 365 shabdi for each day of the year. Plus overseers. Yes. Overseer shabdi. So your afterlife had a workforce. And managers. Even paradise had bureaucracy. We need to talk about something that makes Egyptian afterlife belief feel almost emotionally brutal. Because it's not just about survival. It's about control. In Egypt, death did not make you free. It made you vulnerable. You depended on rituals. You depended on family. You depended on priests. You depended on correct spells. You depended on correct names. You depended on correct writing. And if something went wrong, you could be trapped. You could be hungry. You could be silent. You could be erased. So Egyptians were constantly trying to reduce risk. This is why tombs were hidden. This is why they built in cliffs. This is why they sealed entrances. This is why they created false corridors. This is why they carved warnings. This is why they placed curses. But here's the thing. Tombs were still robbed. Again and again. Even royal tombs. Even in the Valley of the Kings. Which means the Egyptian afterlife system was constantly being attacked. And that changes how we should think about it. Because Egyptians didn't create this system from naive faith. They created it from experience. They knew death was not safe. They knew the world was cruel. They knew people steal. They knew empires invade. They knew memory fades. So they built a religion that tries to outlast all of that. And in doing so, they created one of the most detailed afterlife systems in human history. Next, we're going to go into the do it again. But deeper. Because we've talked about the general idea. Now we need to talk about the geography. The maps. The hours of the night. The sun god's journey. The enemies. The snake. The one being that appears again and again. As the embodiment of chaos. Because if you think judgment is the main danger, you haven't met Apophis yet. There is a strange thing about the Egyptian afterlife. It isn't built around one moment. Not just judgment. Not just the weighing of the heart. Not just the courtroom. It's built around a journey. A long journey. A night journey. A journey that happens again and again. Because the Egyptians believed the universe itself had to be rescued daily. And this is where the Egyptian afterlife stops feeling like a personal spiritual story. And starts feeling like cosmic maintenance. Because in Egyptian belief, the sun did not simply set. The sun died. And every night, the sun god entered the underworld. And traveled through it. And fought through it. And survived it. And only if he survived, the sun rose again. So every sunrise was a victory. Every morning was proof the universe had not collapsed into chaos. And the enemy of this cycle, the one being that wanted the sun to fail, was Apophis. Apep. The giant serpent. The embodiment of chaos. And I want you to picture this. Not a small snake. Not a symbolic snake. A cosmic serpent. A monster large enough to swallow light. A creature that lives in the dark waters of the Duat. A being whose entire purpose is stop the sun. End the world. Return everything to darkness. This is one of the most powerful mythic images ever created. Because it explains why the Egyptians were so obsessed with order. Because order wasn't just a nice moral idea. It was the thing keeping existence alive. And every night, the sun god Ra, traveling in his solar bark, had to pass through the underworld and face Apophis. And the terrifying part is, Apophis wasn't defeated forever. He wasn't killed permanently. He returned. Again and again. night after night. So the universe was never safe. It was constantly under threat. And if the gods themselves had to fight nightly, what chance did you have? This is where the Duat becomes more than a place. It becomes a war zone. A battlefield. And your afterlife journey was tied to that cosmic war. Because the Egyptians believed the dead could join Ra. They could travel with him. They could be part of his crew. They could help defend him. And this is one of the strangest twists. Because it means your afterlife was not just personal survival. It was service. It was participation in cosmic stability. In other words, you weren't just trying to live forever. You were trying to keep the sun rising. Let's talk about the hours of the night. Because Egyptians didn't imagine the underworld as one big dark cave. They imagined it as structured. Divided. Organized. Of course they did. The night was divided into 12 hours. And each hour had its own region. Its own dangers. Its own gatekeepers. Its own beings. So the Duat was like a 12-level dungeon. And the sun god's boat had to pass through each level. And if you want to understand why the Book of the Dead had so many spells, this is why. Because each hour had different threats. Different guardians. Different passwords. Different procedures. Some of these regions were terrifying. Some were surreal. Some were almost beautiful. And Egyptians wrote entire books describing this journey. Not just the Book of the Dead. There were other underworld texts. Like the Amjuat. The Book of Gates. The Book of Caverns. These were essentially maps of the night. And these texts were often painted on the walls of royal tombs. Because pharaohs weren't just trying to survive. They were trying to merge with Ra. To become part of the solar cycle. To become divine. So when you look at a royal tomb, you're not just seeing decoration. You're seeing an instruction manual. Let's step into one of these hours. Because I want you to feel the atmosphere. Imagine darkness. Not empty darkness. But living darkness. A thick, heavy, almost liquid darkness. Imagine water. Black water. Still. Unmoving. And in that water, things move. Shapes. Creatures. And the boat of Ra travels through it. The boat is not alone. It is guarded. Protected. Filled with gods. There is often Set, the violent god, acting as defender. Mehen, the coiled serpent protector. Gods with knives. Gods with spears. Gods who shout spells. And every time Apophis attacks, they strike him. They cut him. They bind him. They burn him. They chant. They stab. They scream. Because the battle is not silent. This is important. Because we often imagine ancient religion as calm. Quiet. Temple whispers. The Egyptian underworld is not calm. It is loud. It is full of shouting. Full of commands. Full of threats. Full of violence. And the reason is simple. Chaos doesn't respond to politeness. Here's where this gets even stranger. Egyptians didn't just tell stories about this battle. They performed it. There were rituals. Real rituals. Where priests would reenact the defeat of Apophis. They would create images of him. Models. Wax figures. Drawings. And then they would destroy them. They would stab them. Spit on them. Burn them. Cut them. Because the ritual wasn't symbolic. It was participation. It was helping the gods. So imagine living in Egypt. And during certain festivals, you gather. And priests publicly destroy a serpent effigy. That's not just religion. That's psychological warfare against chaos. Let's talk about the deeper meaning of Apophis. Because he isn't just a monster. He is the fear of disorder. The fear that the Nile will not flood. The fear that crops will fail. The fear that invasion will come. The fear that disease will spread. The fear that the king will lose control. The fear that the world will stop making sense. Apophis is every nightmare Egypt had. Given a body. Given scales. Given teeth. And the underworld journey was essentially the story of surviving those nightmares. If you're wondering, what does this have to do with me, the dead person? Everything. Because Egyptians believed the dead had to travel through the Duat too. Not exactly the same way as RA. But the same environment. The same threats. The same chaos. And if you wanted to survive, you needed to know the geography. You needed to know the names. You needed to know the spells. This is why knowledge was power in the afterlife. In the Egyptian underworld, ignorance kills. If you don't know the name of a gatekeeper, you cannot pass. If you don't know the correct spell, you cannot open the door. If you don't know the correct declaration, you cannot defend yourself. So the Book of the Dead is not comforting scripture. It's survival gear. And this makes the Egyptian afterlife deeply elitist. Because knowledge was not equally distributed. Literacy was rare. Most people could not read. So how did they use the Book of the Dead? They didn't. Not directly.